Welcome, my dear guests, to the captivating expanses of my story. Chapter 14, 2212. Nadine Heimber stared spellbound at the flickering hologram in front of her. The figure of Dr. Chausiku Uba, distorted and blurred like a ghost from a bygone era, hovered in the center of the High Council of Genetic Guardians. The air was tense as the recorded message began with an eerie hiss. To the Helix. To anyone who can still listen, Uba's voice croaked, broken and barely recognizable. A shiver ran down Nadine's spine. Uba's eyes darted wildly, fixing on points in space that only she could see, invisible horrors threatening to unleash Nadine's imagination. What we found. It's not from this world. Not of any world we could ever have dreamed of. Nadine leaned forward, her fingers clutching the armrests of her chair until her knuckles turned white. She felt the naked fear in Uba's voice, a fear that poured over her body like ice-cold water and made her heart beat wild and staccato. The Leviathan. Dead, but not dead. Its mass is immeasurable. Its form. Indescribable. Uba swallowed hard, sweat glistening on her ashen forehead, and her eyes widened in horror. It contradicts everything we thought we knew. Everything the Helix teaches. It shatters the foundations of our understanding of the universe. A murmur went through the council. Some older members shook their heads in disbelief, and others stared wide-eyed at the trembling hologram. I see things. Shadows are moving where there is no light. Shapes that distort and change. Uba's voice became a hoarse whisper that shook Nadine to the core. They are calling me. They show me truths that I cannot bear. Realities that challenge our understanding of existence. Nadine felt her stomach tighten painfully. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She knew Uba and admired her strength and her unshakable faith. This broken figure before her, a shadow of herself, was barely recognizable. Where was the brilliant scientist who had fearlessly explored the boundaries of the known? We should never should have gone this far. The universe holds secrets that are not meant for us. Abysses into which no mortal eye should peer. Uba's eyes suddenly widened in boundless panic as if she were glimpsing something unspeakable. They're coming. Oh gods, they're here. The boundaries between worlds are blurring. The hologram flickered wildly, distorted into grotesque shapes, and then abruptly went out. An oppressive, almost palpable silence settled over the room like a shroud. Nadine rose slowly, her legs trembling. Her thoughts raced, desperately trying to process what she had heard and understand the implications. Brothers and sisters, she began, her voice trembling slightly. What we have seen here confirms our worst fears. The expansion into space has led us to a precipice from which we must retreat. Murmurs of agreement filled the hall. Nadine's eyes glowed with renewed fire. We must act. Now. The colonies must be recalled, and the ships ordered back. We must return to our roots, to the teachings of the Helix that promise us protection and purity. The High Council nodded in unison. The fear in their eyes gave way to grim determination. Nadine looked at the space where Uba's hologram had been hovering. For Chausiku. For Kasach. For the purity of our species. We will not rest until we undo the expansion's damage. Nadine rushed through the vast corridors of the Imperial Palace, her heart racing with excitement and worry. The disturbing hologram message from Chausiku Uba still echoed in her ears. She had to find her mother and tell her about this terrible discovery. Nadine Heimber was standing at the window of her private study, gazing into the distance, when her daughter burst in. Mother! Gasped Nadine, you have to see this. Now! With trembling hands, Nadine activated the hologram. Chausiku's distorted face flickered before them, fear and horror in her eyes. A Leviathan. Indescribable. Cosmic horrors. Her broken voice reached their ears before the image faded. Nadine turned to her mother, desperation in her gaze. We have to act, Mother. We must call everyone back and return to our roots before it's too late. Savia sighed heavily. Her face was a mask of resignation as if she had waited a long time for this moment and yet dreaded it. It's time you knew the truth, my daughter, she said quietly. Without another word, Savia led Nadine out of the study. They traversed corridors Nadine had never seen before, descending stairs that seemed to lead deep into the palace's foundations. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door hidden behind centuries-old tapestries. Savia placed her hand on a hidden scanner. With a soft hiss, the door opened, revealing a small chamber. In the center was an old holoprojector that immediately came to life when they entered. "What you are about to see," Savia said in a severe voice, "is the true story of our origins. The footage is from the time the DSE reached Erasmus Kasach." The hologram flickered and showed the face of a woman whose features seemed strangely familiar to Nadine. The woman began to speak, her voice tinged with exhaustion and relief. "We have made it. Kasach. Our new home. But the price was high." The woman paused, tears glistening in her eyes. "We psionics were hunted. The Alliance for the Preservation of Humanity pursued us throughout the solar system. The DSE Erasmus was our last hope, our ark ship to escape this persecution and the mycelium runners on Earth." Nadine gasped. Everything she thought she knew about Kasach's history began to crumble. The woman in the hologram continued, "We would never have made it without the help of the Soul Seller and his Flying Dutchman on board. They took us to a phenomenon in the outer solar system that the Soul Salesman called Hydra. We flew through it, as did some Alliance ships." Nadine stared transfixed at the flickering hologram. Her mind refused to process what she was hearing. All the stories, all the teachings of the Helix, were they nothing but lies? She turned to her mother, confusion and pain in her eyes. Savia gently placed a hand on Nadine's shoulder. "There is more to tell, my daughter," she said softly, her voice an anchor in the storm of emotions raging inside Nadine. "But first, you must understand why we have hidden this truth for so long." Savia played the next recording. The hologram flickered briefly and then showed an exhausted-looking woman in a tattered uniform. Her voice sounded raspy as she began to speak. "We have arrived in a strange place. The stars. They look different. Unreal. The wrecks of 2 Alliance ships are floating near us. We immediately launched a rescue operation." Savia and Nadine watched spellbound as the hologram revealed the surroundings around the DSE Erasmus. An alien solar system dominated by a giant red sun was before them. As they would later learn, Eurasia cast its blood-red light on the surrounding celestial bodies, bathing everything in an unreal glow. The DSE Erasmus floated like a speck of dust compared to the colossal celestial bodies around it. In the distance, the outlines of several planets could be seen, each with its fascinating appearance. One of them, a massive gas giant, attracted particular attention. Its surface was a vortex of shimmering bands pulsating in various shades of red. Between the planets stretched a dense asteroid belt, a chaotic field of rock and ice. The wreckage of the Alliance ships drifted amidst this cosmic landscape, silent witnesses to an unknown tragedy. The red light of Eurasia refracted in the jagged surfaces of the asteroids, creating an eerie play of shadows. It was as if the whole system was breathing in a creepy, pulsating rhythm. The image zoomed in on one of the moons orbiting the gas giant. Deep gorges and rugged mountain ranges crisscrossed its surface. Strange crystalline formations shimmered in the valleys between the mountains, refracting the red light in 1,000 facets. Savia and Nadine exchanged a worried glance. The shot switched to another scene. The Resistance leaders, surviving Alliance commanders, and the Soul Seller sat around a table in a makeshift meeting room. The atmosphere was tense. An Alliance officer with a scarred face eyed the Soul Seller suspiciously. "Something's wrong here," he growled. "How did we all end up in this place simultaneously? And why do I feel weaker by the minute?" Another officer nodded in agreement. "I can feel it, too. It's as if something is draining my life energy." The Soul Salesman sat motionless, his face hidden behind the grinning skull mask. But suddenly, all eyes turned to him. "You!" shouted one of the Resistance fighters. "You're responsible for this." The accusation hung heavy in the air. The Soul Seller tilted his head slightly as if weighing up the words. At that moment, the scarred Alliance officer unobtrusively pulled a small device from his pocket. It was a state-of-the-art genetic analysis instrument that they had secretly smuggled into the room. With practiced movements, he activated it and pointed it at the Soul Seller. The device hummed softly as it carried out its analysis. Those present held their breath as they waited for the result, but the display remained blank. There was no data, no genetics, nothing. The officer frowned and checked the device. It worked perfectly when he pointed it at himself and others in the room. But at the soul cellar, absolute emptiness. "What the hell are you?" the officer asked, his voice a mixture of fear and confusion. The soul salesman stood up slowly. With a fluid movement, he took off the mask. What was hidden behind it caused those present to recoil. Instead of a human face, they saw a swirling chaos of energy and shadows. "You're right," came a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "I am not what you thought I was." The Alliance officers stared in disbelief at their analyzer, which continued to provide no data. They had convicted the soul seller, but the truth was more frightening than anything they could have imagined. What lay behind it caused those present to recoil. Instead of a human face, they saw a swirling chaos of energy and shadows. Horror spread through the room. The soul seller continued undisturbed, "The mycelium on Earth, I set it free. It created you, my perfect food. It was all part of my plan to create my own Shangri-La." The officers jumped up, their hands instinctively groping for weapons. But the soul seller seemed unimpressed. His form flickered and changed as if he were made of living energy. "You can't escape me," he declared in a voice that echoed in the minds of those present. "I have brought you here, far away from everything you knew. Here you are mine." The recording became blurred, and background noise overlaid the people's horrified cries. Nadine stared transfixed at the flickering hologram, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Savia knew this story too well. It had been revealed to her shortly after she had taken the throne, a heavy legacy that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She watched Nadine, whose eyes widened as the implications slowly seeped into her consciousness. Nadine's lips quivered, and words formed, but no sound escaped her throat. Her eyes darted back and forth between the flickering hologram and Savia's serious expression as if looking for a sign that this was all just a cruel joke. The recording continued, revealing new horrors. Among those present, Savia recognized the figure of Anton Solikov, the most potent psyker of his time. His eyes glowed with unnatural intensity as he faced the soul seller. Solikov's hands trembled with barely restrained energy. He unleashed his psionic power with a gesture that seemed to rend the air. A bright flash of light filled the room, causing those present to flinch. The soul seller lurched, its ethereal form flickering and distorting. An inhuman scream echoed through the halls of the DSE Erasmus, a sound somewhere between rage and pain. For the first time, the creature showed signs of vulnerability. Its outline blurred, dissolving at the edges. But instead of dissolving, it contracted, condensing into a pulsating ball of energy. The soul seller spat out his anger in a voice that echoed more in their heads than in their ears, "You ungrateful creatures! I created you, and this is how you repay me?" His words vibrated with barely suppressed rage. "I swear I will return. And then you will know the true price of your rebellion." The energy sphere shot through the walls of the DSE Erasmus, leaving nothing behind but a tail of fading light. Out in the vacuum of space, it formed into a bizarre ship whose contours seemed to fluctuate constantly. Nadine stared at the scene with wide eyes. Her usually composed face was ashen, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. This can't be," she whispered, her voice a brittle flicker in the heavy silence. "All our teachings, our sacred writings. They were a lie?" Her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to comprehend the force of this revelation. Savia gently placed a hand on Nadine's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through the priestess's body like an electric shock. "I know it's unimaginably difficult to accept," she said with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the harshness of the truth. "But this is the genuine reality of our origins. A burden that every imperatrix has had to carry silently for generations." Nadine shook her head in disbelief, her short gray hair swirling around her pale face like a gale-force wind. "But why?" Her voice broke. "Why have we been lied to all these years, all these centuries? Who gave us the right to make such a decision?" Savia sighed heavily. The weight of millennia seemed to rest on her shoulders. "To protect us. To give us a hope we could cling to." She paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "The naked truth. It would have broken us when we were most vulnerable, defenseless in an alien, hostile universe." Taking a deep breath, Savia continued her voice, which was a faint echo of times past. "This happened over 2,300 years ago. The DSE Erasmus, our last refuge, made it to the moon of Avalon with a few survivors. There, On this barren celestial body, we painstakingly began to rebuild our world. She paused, her gaze fixed in the distance as if she could see history through the palace's walls. The surviving Alliance members, scarred by the horrors of the past, became the founders of the Helix. They formed our faith, our society, out of fear, hope, and a desperate desire to never be so vulnerable again. Joanna Fritsch stood before the Imperial Senate, her posture as tense as a string stretched to breaking point, her gaze severe and unfathomable. The silence in the hall weighed heavily on those present as if the air felt the weight of her unspoken words, and every breath had to be laboriously fought for. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling barely noticeably beneath her immaculately fitted uniform, before speaking. Honorable Senators, Imperatrix Savia, her voice echoed through the marble hall, clear and firm despite the palpable tension within her. I stand before you today with news of the Roe threat that could call into question the fate of us all. The senators moved forward in their seats, the soft rustle of their robes like a collective inhale. Their faces reflected a mixture of fear and burning curiosity, emotions that seemed to multiply in the ornately carved pillars of the hall. Joanna continued, each of her words carefully weighed as if balancing on a fine line between hope and despair. Our tireless efforts to contact this mysterious alien civilization have so far come to nothing. It is as if they are deliberately keeping us in the dark, playing a cosmic game of hide and seek with us. No matter how sophisticated, any attempt to intercept their cryptic signals or gain even a hint of understanding of their superior technology bounces off their impenetrable defenses like light off a black hole. A collective murmur swelled and ebbed as a wave of unrest surged through the ranks of the senators. Senator Voss, a man of imposing stature and even more impressive ego, rose abruptly. His voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a scalpel. How can this be? We have the most advanced technology in the known universe. Our scientists have spent decades perfecting our systems. Joanna nodded gravely, her expression a mask of professional composure that concealed a storm of frustration and concern. That's what we all thought, Senator. But the Roe threat. They operate on a level beyond our comprehension. Our advanced sensors, which we have always relied on, can barely detect their ships, let alone crack the encrypted codes of their communications. It's as if we were trying to calculate quantum physics with an abacus. Imperatrix Savia, a figure of timeless elegance and sharp intellect, leaned forward in her throne-like seat. Her piercing eyes, which had fought countless diplomatic battles, sparkled in the flickering light of the ornately crafted crystal chandeliers. Joanna, have we gained any insight, however vague, into her intentions? Joanna felt her throat constrict. She swallowed hard, frustration coloring her voice with a hint of bitterness. I regret to disappoint you, Your Highness. Their motives remain as opaque as the alloys of their starships. We grope in the dark, unable to fathom whether they perceive us as a threat, as potential allies, or whether we are of no more importance to them than specks of dust in the cosmic wind. The words hung heavy in the air. Nadine Heimber, representative of the Helix Church, rose slowly. Perhaps this is a divine test? A sign that we should focus on our genetic purity instead of venturing into the unknown? Joanna bit her lip, unsure how to respond. Myra Gupta beat her to it. With respect, Sister Nadine, but retreat is not an option. We need to understand what we're up against. I agree, Paulina Romero spoke up, her military stance unmistakable. But how are we supposed to defend ourselves against something we can't understand? Joanna looked around, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the senator's eyes. She felt the weight of her following words. Senators, Imperatrix, I suggest that we. Paulina Romero stood at the window of her office and looked down at the glittering towers of Xanadu. A satisfied smile played around her lips. After months of tough negotiations and clever maneuvering, her faction, the One Throne supporters, had finally gained the upper hand. The Imperial Senate seethed with excitement. Senators hurried through the marble corridors, their voices a chaotic crescendo of triumphant cheers and restrained protests. Paulina Romero stood motionless amid the tumult, her breathing deep and controlled. The air was vibrating with tension. She felt it in every fiber of her body. This day would go down as a turning point in the history of Kasach. The atmosphere in the imposing Senate chamber crackled like static electricity. The massive crystal chandeliers cast flickering shadows on the tense faces of those present. Imperatrix Savia Heimber entered the room with a majestic presence. Her face resembled a perfectly composed mask of regal serenity, but her eyes betrayed the gravity of the moment ahead. As if at an inaudible command, the senators fell silent instantly. Savia strode to the podium, her jeweled robes glittering in the light. "Honorable members of the Imperial Senate," she began, her voice powerful and clear as a crystal gong. "We are balancing on the edge of an epochal change. In these turbulent times of upheaval and shocking revelations, we have realized a fundamental truth: our insurmountable strength is rooted in our unity. This unity emanates from an indomitable center and wraps itself around our empire like a protective shield." Myra Gupta, the charismatic leader of the elite citizens' union, sat tensely in her chair. Her brow furrowed deeply as she absorbed the Imperatrix's words. An uneasy feeling spread through the pit of her stomach. With growing unease, she suspected what Savia's speech would lead to and what consequences this could have for her vision of a just, meritocratic society. Savia continued, "The Senate, in its wisdom, has decided to add the aspect of exclusivity to our development tradition. This emphasizes the central role of the chosen in our society and the need to protect their position." A murmur went through the rows. Nadine Heimber from the conclave of exalted clarices stood up. "Imperatrix, what should this exclusivity look like?" Paulina stepped forward, her eyes sparkling with determination. "It means that we concentrate power where it can be used most effectively, in the hands of those who have proven that they act for the good of the Imperium." Rita Griffin of the Homo sapiens dominance faction nodded in agreement. "At a time when strangers and the unknown surround us, we must remember our strengths." Myra Gupta shook her head. "But don't we risk overlooking talents and innovations that could come from unexpected sources?" Savia raised her hand placatingly. "Your concerns are heard, Senator Gupta. But remember, there is protection in exclusivity. Protection from the dangers that threaten us from the outside and the fragmentation that could weaken us from within." The debate swayed back and forth, with voices raised in agreement and protest. But in the end, it was clear, the One Throne supporters had won. Their vision of a robust and centralized empire would shape the future of Kasach. As the meeting drew close, Paulina stepped to Savia's side. "Imperatrix, you have chosen wisely. With this strengthening of the center, we can withstand all challenges." Savia nodded slowly. "I hope so, Paulina. I sincerely hope so." Almar Kazan sat in the KNN studio, surrounded by flickering screens and whirring cameras. His eyes fixed on the camera lens as he spoke calmly but insistently. "Today, we look back at the Marinkaran containment project on Citus Sim, almost a year after the operation began." A hologram of Citus Sim's mist-shrouded moorland appeared behind him. The purple flowers of the Marinkaran plant glowed eerily in the twilight. "A year ago, our colony was on the brink of chaos. The Marinkaran, initially welcomed as a botanical curiosity, turned out to be a threat to the life and limb of our colonists." Images of rapturously smiling people wandering through the streets of Nasus City flickered across the screen. The plant, whose pollen affected human neurochemistry, put the colonists into a trance-like state. Productivity dropped, and social structures disintegrated. Memories of the lotus eaters of old Earth became painfully vivid. Kazan's voice became more serious as he continued, "Governor Elena Volkov declared a state of emergency. In an unprecedented operation, special units have been dispatched from Kasach, equipped with protective suits and new herbicides." Footage of soldiers in hermetic suits marching through the purple fields and spraying chemicals appeared on the screen. The containment was brutal but effective. Entire ecosystems were destroyed to stop the spread. Critics called it ecological genocide. Supporters called it a necessary evil. Kazan leaned forward, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "Today, a year later, we are seeing the aftermath of these drastic measures. The Marinkaran has been largely eradicated, but the traces of its existence are omnipresent." New pictures showed bare areas where lush vegetation once thrived. Workers in protective suits took soil samples while scientists worked in mobile laboratories. The soils of Citus Sim are slowly recovering. Special bacterial cultures have been used to break down the residues of herbicides. But the real challenges lie in the human psyche. The camera zoomed in on Kazan's serious face. Many colonists are suffering from the aftereffects of Marinkaran exposure. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of emptiness are common. Rehabilitation centers are working around the clock to help those affected. He paused briefly before continuing, "But there is also hope. New settlements are springing up in the cleansed areas. The colonists are showing remarkable resilience. Community projects to reforest and build new infrastructure are flourishing. Images of smiling people planting trees and erecting new buildings appeared on the screen. The crisis has strengthened the community on CitisSim. A new awareness of the ecosystem's fragility and the importance of cohesion has emerged. Kazan's eyes sparkled as he concluded. The Marinkaran containment project was a test for our colony. A test we passed, albeit at a high price. The future of CitisSim remains uncertain, but the will and determination of its people are unwavering. Almar Kazan sat enthroned in the KNN Broadcasting Center amid flickering lights and humming recording equipment. He fell silent abruptly when an employee rushed over with a data unit. His pupils widened noticeably as he scanned the incoming breaking news. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a calm but insistent voice, "we interrupt our regularly scheduled program for an extraordinary announcement from the Imperial Palace." Kazan's fingers flew across the hologram interface in front of him. A majestic image of the divine Imperatrix Nadine Heimber filled the screen behind him. She stood on a balcony, clad in shimmering robes that glittered in the soft light of the setting sun. "News has just reached us that Her Divine Majesty has proclaimed a new edict," Kazan continued. His voice vibrated with suppressed excitement. "In a solemn ceremony, the Imperatrix has spoken the words that will lead our empire into a new era." He read out the words of the Imperatrix. Each syllable is emphasized with reverence and respect. Respect is the indispensable foundation of the political sphere. The insistence on the privileges of the elect is the original impetus of our rule. We must ensure that those who watch over and govern our empire can do so in safety and dignity. Kazan paused to let the meaning of these words sink in. His eyes sparkled as he continued, "With these words, the divine Imperatrix has proclaimed the edict the guardians of the aristocracy." He explained the details of the proclamation, his voice filled with admiration. "An elite guard, specially trained and equipped, will subsequently protect the outstanding figures of our society. This is a milestone in the history of our empire." Images of cheering crowds on the streets of Xanadu flickered across the screen. Kazan commented, "As you can see, this decision is being greeted with enthusiasm throughout the empire. Citizens recognize the need to protect those who carry the heavy burden of leadership." He turned to the camera, his eyes shining with conviction. "This is undoubtedly a historic moment for our realm. The divine Imperatrix has proven once again that she understands the needs of our society and acts decisively to fulfill them." Kazan leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression flitting across his face. "The effects of this mandate will certainly be far-reaching. We will follow developments closely and inform you, dear viewers, of any news." Lena Schultz stood on the bridge of the ex-Susquehanna and watched as the final construction phase of the outpost in the Bona system drew to a close. The stars twinkled coldly through the viewports while the 5 planets of the system orbited in the distance. None of them were habitable, but that did not diminish the strategic importance of this outpost to the Empire in the Kost sector. Lena pushed a rebellious strand of her ash-blonde hair behind her ear and let her fingers glide over the data pad. The displays pulsed a reassuring green. The outpost was developing precisely as planned. A familiar tingle prickled in her fingertips, the irresistible need to capture this moment in color. "Victor, you have the bridge," she addressed her stoic first officer. "An urgent matter requires my attention." Victor acknowledged the order with a curt nod. Lena crossed the corridors of the Susquehanna with purposeful steps. In the seclusion of her cabin, she took out a compact easel and fixed an immaculate canvas on it. Her hands moved as if of their own accord as she mixed the pigments on the palette. Inky black for the unfathomable depths of the cosmos, sparkling silver for the twinkling stars, glowing orange for the looming outpost. The colors seemed to vibrate under her fingers, eager to capture the moment's essence. Lena lost herself in her thoughts as the brush glided across the canvas. For over a decade, she had roamed the far corners of the galaxy on behalf of the Empire. Each system she visited revealed a unique character, an unmistakable aesthetic. The Bona system, with its 5 hostile planets and glistening red dwarf star, held a particular fascination for her. It stood in stark contrast to the lush moorlands of CitisSim or the majestic gas giants of Q-Turn, orbited by an orange-colored star. Lena's hand guided the brush in flowing movements. She captured the stark contrast between light and darkness that spread out in space before her eyes. These quiet moments of contemplation were sacred to her. Here, for a short time, she could shed the burden of her responsibilities as commander and forget her worries about the ship and crew. In these moments, she was simply Lena, the artist trying to capture the sublime beauty of the cosmos on canvas. The shrill beeping of her communicator abruptly broke through her meditative immersion. Victor's voice announced the completion of the final construction phase. With a soft sigh, Lena put the brush aside and stepped back. Her eyes wandered over the half-finished painting, scrutinizing it. The NASA outpost hovered in the middle of the infinite blackness of space, surrounded by a sea of sparkling silver stars. The cold beauty of space contrasted with the warm hues of the human construction, a symbol of the Empire's expansion into the vastness of the universe. She took a step back and smiled with satisfaction. This space panorama would fit in nicely with her growing collection. Each picture told a story, reminding her of the places she had visited and the missions she had fulfilled. Lena wiped the paint off her hands and returned to the bridge. It was time to celebrate the successful completion of her mission and take her next orders from the Empire. But part of her was already looking forward to the next system, the next adventure, and the next painting that would come out of it. Hey, I would be happy if you could give my video a like, leave a comment and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date.